So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this student conference on global challenges. I am Rogelio Minana. I'm the Vice Provost for Global Engagement. And I'm here just to give brief welcome remarks and then introduce our keynote speaker, who I think is ready. And maybe he can test his video to make sure that his video works as well. There you go. There we have Bruce. Good morning. So let me just give very brief remarks and then I'll introduce our speaker. So first of all, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to our 16th annual student conference on global challenges. It's truly remarkable that we've been doing this for 16 years through the pandemic, through whatever global conditions throw at us. Our students are there. They're still doing amazing work, research, engagement abroad, and that shows through this conference. So I just want to give you a very warm welcome. I think and I hope that next year we should be able to do this in a hybrid mode so that on the one hand, we have face-to-face interaction here in Philadelphia, but hopefully my hope is that we can also welcome our guests and partners abroad so that they can also join us for this conference. So more about that next year. In terms of this year, the theme for the conference this year is Life in the City. What could be more relevant today than talking about urban development and cities? And the reason is because according to the World Bank, in a 2023 report, some 56% of the world's population already live in cities. And it's expected that by 2050, which is only a few years from today, by 2050, nearly 70% of the world population will live in cities. More than 80% of the global GDP is already generated in cities. And the expansion of urban land consumption outpaces population growth by as much as 50%. So the world population grows, but cities grow at a much faster pace. So cities clearly play a very important role in terms of climate change, economic development, disaster risk management, in equality, diversity, inclusion, belonging, and in so many ways, cities are so important. Drexel is obviously an urban campus. We are in a city, the city of Philadelphia, which is a global city with very vibrant immigrant communities, refugee communities, people of all kinds of backgrounds. And also we have a strong presence abroad, as well as a lot of companies and organizations have a presence here in Philadelphia with us. So what a better place than Drexel University to talk about life in the city. So we are very focused, obviously, to address inequalities and global issues such as climate change. And this is evidenced throughout our program. We have today alone, in just one day, we have almost every college and school at Drexel represented. We have undergraduate students, graduate students, faculty members, addressing topics that range from politics, justice, and community to science, design, and technology, business and economic trends, public health, and medical innovations. At the end of the day, at 3 p.m., we will conclude with a phenomenal panel of university and community thought leaders around the issue of community engagement in urban environments. I have to briefly thank the people who have made this possible, the colleagues, my colleagues who have made this possible. Ryan Day and Anna Hill have been absolutely key in making this happen from a logistics perspective. Adam Zahn has been the one who led the group to put this event together. And we have many panel chairs, presenters, debaters, guests, and participants from all over the greater Philadelphia area. To all of you, thank you for joining us and a warm welcome. I want to also welcome especially the high school students who will be joining us throughout the day, high school students from the Philadelphia area. Finally, I want to thank, of course, our distinguished keynote speaker, Bruce Katz, who is the co-founder and inaugural director of the Nowak Metro Finance Lab here at Drexel University. The title of his talk is The Industrial Transition and the U.S. City. And Bruce's curriculum is very extensive and very distinguished. So I'm just gonna briefly summarize it. He advises regularly global, national, state, regional, and municipal government and leaders on public reforms and private innovations that advance the well-being of metropolitan areas. Professor Katz is the co-author of a couple books out of Brookings Institution Press, one from 2013, one from 2018, on how cities can thrive in the age of populism and how also metros are fixing our broken politics and fragile economy. So the role of cities in politics and economics. Professor Katz was the inaugural Centennial Scholar at the Brookings Institution from 2016 to 2018. He joined Drexel from the Brookings Institution, and before that, he served as Chief of Staff to U.S. Housing and Urban Development Secretary Henry Cisneros, but he's also played a number of different roles in the U.S. Senate and at the White House, advising and working for always in the space of housing and urban affairs. He has also been a visiting professor at the London School of Economics, one of the top institutions in the world in terms of politics and economics. He gives dozens of lectures and presentations annually all over the world, and he has received the prestigious Heinz Award in Public Policy, and he is a graduate of Brown University and Yale Law. So we are very, very lucky to have him here at Drexel. And we are even more lucky and grateful because he will open this conference with what's going to be a wonderful keynote speech. So thank you so much, Bruce. We look forward to your thoughts on urban development, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, Vice Provost. And Anna has kindly agreed to sort of help me work this deck today. And so this is a presentation called Everything Everywhere All at Once. And I think for people listening to this, it will be, I think, quite different from the usual city presentation, because normally, what we tend to focus on in the United States and elsewhere is how to plan the post-industrial city. But we're going through a remarkable industrial and energy transition in the United States, and it's really compelling public, private, and civic leaders and university leaders to think about how to deliver the industrial metropolis. So this is a remarkable period. And next slide. So this is work that is based on research that we have underway with two partners. We work with a group called Accelerator for America on issues related to the Inflation Reduction Act. That's the act focused on dealing with climate crisis. And then we work with the Aspen Institute Latinos in Society program on a range of efforts around advanced manufacturing, military spending, and the procurement economy. So what I'm presenting is informed by these two partnerships. Next slide. So what I'm going to talk about today, and here's just a summary, is that we are going through a remarkable restructuring of the US economy because of mega forces, which I'll talk through, and unprecedented federal spending. And at the end of the day, what this is doing is driving a reshoring of manufacturing and accelerated decarbonization of the US economy. This is what is called modern supply side economics by the Biden administration. And it's really pulling together a whole range of different investments. The good news is that this is being distributed across a broad set of cities, metropolitan areas, regions, and states in the United States. The challenging news, as you'll see, is that a lot of the large manufacturing facilities are being located at the periphery of our metropolitan areas, far from central cities or older suburbs. So we're experiencing a kind of industrial sprawl, which basically impedes our effort to use this industrial transition to promote supplier diversity, business development, and workforce diversity. And cities are beginning to adapt to this, to try to find a way into this industrial transition that will make it more likely that it'll be inclusive. So that's the executive summary. Next slide, I'll just start walking through all this, and you'll see how this is organized. First, I'm going to talk about the nature of this economic transition. So next slide. You know, in the US as elsewhere, we tend to always focus on the new normal. At the Nowak Metro Finance Lab, we focus on what we call the new disorder. As a New York Times journalist said about a year ago, it's almost like you have a snow globe and everything has just been upheaved and the flakes have not settled yet. We still have the aftermath of COVID, remote work in our central business districts. But frankly, the most long-standing effects on our economy are going to be new geopolitical tensions, given the war in the Ukraine and rising tensions with China, and then the accelerated efforts to deal with the climate crisis and racial justice. So there's an enormous amount of big upheaval out there. Next slide. What I will focus on today is partly about the Biden administration effort to remake industrial policy, probably the most ambitious effort, as you see from this quote from the Financial Times, since the Second World War around industrial policy. And a good portion of that industrial policy is really around national security, given the growing tensions with China and the growing tensions or continued tensions between China and Taiwan. So this is the big picture, macro forces that ultimately come to settle in metropolitan areas. Next slide. When you add up these disruptive forces and you add to them federal investments that are unprecedented, what you essentially see on the right side of this chart is a kind of reshoring of production that we've not seen in the United States for decades. We've basically had an economy committed to globalization and, in my view, excessive offshoring and outsourcing. We have a kind of remilitarization because of these tensions with Russia and China, and we have this decarbonization effort underway. These are very complicated dynamics, and they're all happening simultaneously. Next slide. Now, the Biden administration, I think, very smartly and strategically, led by Janet Yellen and other senior members of the administration, including the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, the former governor of Rhode Island, have put forward this thesis of modern supply-side economics and the necessity, the imperative to basically act on labor supply, human capital, public infrastructure, R&D, and a climate oriented economy all at the same time. And then they put money where their mouth is. They have passed a series of very large bills, the American Rescue Plan, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, CHIPS and Science Act, Inflation Reduction Act, and the Department of Defense appropriations. So this is unprecedented in terms of federal investment, but it's all geared to this larger purpose of nation rebuilding. Next slide. You'll see how some of these different bills ultimately make very sizable and scaled investments in energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, and a whole range of manufacturing-oriented sectors like electric vehicles, semiconductors, and so forth. So this is profound. Next slide. Now, the states are also playing big roles, not uniformly. We have 50 states, and they all have different levels of interventionist policy. In Michigan, they have tended to use state and federal funding to invest in centers of excellence, particularly in Detroit, around the old Amtrak station, which is now owned by Ford Motor Company, other efforts in the downtown. In Ohio and New York State, they've made major investments to attract large semiconductor facilities. And then California and elsewhere, they have more of a regional approach, allowing regions of the state, given how large California is and some other states, to invest and help different parts of the state plan the next generation future. Next slide. Now, the sum up of all this, as I said before, is very positive at one level, and I'll walk through this. This is a very distributed manufacturing resurgence and innovation resurgence. But the big challenge is this industrial sprawl locational issue, which undermines the ability to sort of grow Black and Latino business and to have a broader equity effect on our workforce. Next slide. Cities are responding, as they always do, and they're with their metropolitan areas, but cities are not governments, they're really networks of public, private, civic, university leaders and institutions. So you'll begin, as I talk through this later in the presentation, to see what is emerging as a bottom-up industrial policy that complements and amplifies and furthers the national industrial policy. This is how the US works. It's both network-driven with an enormous amount of power delegated down to our cities and metropolitan areas. The federal government may be the major investor in all this, but the cities and the metropolitan areas ultimately need to design and deliver industrial policy. Next slide. So let's talk about this distributed geography of production. Next slide. The US has a long history of our geography of production being shaped by national security concerns. This is an extract from the Defense Production Act of 1950, where the Congress literally said explicitly it's the goal of the US government to encourage the geographic dispersal of industrial facilities to protect the country from a first strike from Russia. So we began to distribute out many of our manufacturing facilities across the US. Next slide. As everyone on this presentation knows, the US, like many Western economies, has seen a dramatic decrease in manufacturing workforce as we've globalized and offshored. And that is particularly true in the semiconductor space, which is an industry which permeates all the other industries. So we have a lot of catching up and reversing of prior policy that has to happen in this period. Next slide. Manufacturing, even as it is dispersed and deconcentrated, is very distributed across the United States. This slide shows the clustering of aerospace, automotive, and IT in different metropolitan areas and regions of the United States. And as these production facilities begin to grow and expand in different parts of our country, ecosystems begin to grow around them, whether it's research universities, community colleges around workforce, logistics infrastructure, so forth and so on. It's not the production facility by itself that matters in the manufacturing space. It's how you surround it with a broader ecosystem. Next slide. The military industrial complex, as President Eisenhower called it, is also highly distributed across the United States. These slides basically show where the major defense production contractors, whether it's Boeing, whether it's General Dynamics, whether it's Lockheed Martin, whether it's Raytheon, have some of their major facilities. And then on the right side is the Defense Department's description of where they have many of their assets located. So the US is a highly distributed economy. And that is deeply affected by this industrial resurgence. Next slide. So this is a White House map of the US, which begins to show where the manufacturing boom is happening in semiconductors, in clean energy, in biomanufacturing, and other heavy industry. And you can immediately see from this map that the White House has provided $435 billion in 240 projects nationwide, that there's a high concentration in states like Arizona, in New York, in Texas, across these different sectors of the economy. Next slide. When you look at semiconductors, what we're seeing is a concentration in states like Arizona, again, Texas, New York, Ohio, and Indiana. So there's a lot of talk about the semiconductor industry and how critical it is to national security. But when it actually plays out in the country, the large facilities are going to these 5 states. Next slide. When you talk about the electric vehicle and the electrification of the auto sector, which is one of the biggest industrial transformations in the last 100 years, that tends to be located in this north-south band from Michigan to Alabama, given the sort of concentration in the Midwest, and particularly in Michigan, of many of the traditional automakers in the US. But then the growth of the Southeast over the last 30 or 40 years, as we began to see Asian and European automakers make their way into the US market. So here's a very different geography with a very different sector. Next slide. And as we look to clean energy, and I don't think this will be too surprising, offshore wind, which is going to be a major production sector, is mostly concentrated on the East Coast, while California, Arizona, and Texas are playing significant roles in solar power. So next slide. One thing to recognize about our economy because of NAFTA is there are deep relationships with Canada and Mexico. This focuses on the nearshoring efforts that are underway in Mexico. So the US, as we begin to reshore, also have very intricate supply chains with our largest trading partners, Canada and Mexico, and those will continue to play out. And interestingly enough, many Chinese companies are beginning to move into Mexico because of the growing tensions with the US and are trying to remain relevant to our manufacturing capacity. Next slide. So that's a broad positive story, to tell you the truth, around how different sectors of the production economy begin to distribute across the vast landscape that is the United States. Now we come to the challenges part. Next slide. What we're seeing, and we've mapped a whole range of mega deals, these are deals where there's more than $50 million of public subsidy, is that a large portion of the new manufacturing factories, whether they're in the semiconductor space or whether they're in the electric vehicle battery space, are located far from the central cores of US metropolitan areas, which means they're far from many suppliers and they're far from universities and other anchor institutions that play a very substantial research role. Next slide. So when the large plants are located at the periphery, and this is a map of Kansas City, it doesn't mean that all manufacturing is located at the periphery. And it may make sense for many large factories that need 1,000 acres, let's say, heavily resourced by water and other energy, to locate in certain parts of a metropolis. But many tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers don't need all that land, and they tend to concentrate back in either the central city or in some of the suburban communities. So when we're talking about a manufacturing ecosystem, it's really critical to understand the full geography of that ecosystem, both between the large firms and their suppliers, and then the other supportive institutions and intermediaries. Next slide. Now, what's really important, and this is critical since we're having a Drexel conversation today, is research institutions in many parts of the US. And here's an example from the Department of Defense-backed manufacturing innovation institutes, which work with universities. Research institutions do tend, in many cases, to be concentrated in the core of the city. So you can immediately see the complexity of the emerging geography in the United States. Large factories at the periphery of our metropolitan areas or beyond in rural counties, micropolitan areas, suppliers located all across a metropolitan area, cities, suburbs, exurbs, rural areas, and universities perhaps located back in the central core. So all this ultimately has to integrate together if we're going to be productive and innovative. But the geographic challenges are immense. Next slide. So what we're experiencing in part is a level of job sprawl here. You tend to have, in many parts of this country, and here is Phoenix, a large portion of workers, a portion of which are Black and Latino, concentrated either in the central city. Phoenix is a very large city, by the way, about 500 square miles, but located in portions of the central core, far away from where many of these new factories and facilities are located. So we already have a spatial mismatch between where workers live and where jobs are located, creating a lot of commuting challenges. Next slide. This is particularly true with the Black community. This is Detroit. A large portion of the African American community live in the core of Detroit. This map shows where they live, whereas the manufacturing facilities, with regard to this electrification of the auto sector, are located far away from their residential communities. Again, to some extent, transit, reliable transit, frequent transit, doesn't work when you have this spatial mismatch. So this exacerbates commuting challenges to a dramatic degree. Next slide. When we get to suppliers, and this is a major focus of the Nowak Metro Finance Lab with our partners at the Aspen Institute, we're trying to think through how do we grow Black and Latino and Asian firms, women-owned firms that can participate in the next generation economy, which is likely to generate higher profits and higher wages for workers. Well, the challenging part is the starting point of Asian, Latino, and particularly Black firms in construction, in manufacturing, and in the energy sector through utilities are nowhere near their share of the population. So if we're going to have an inclusive outcome to this industrial transition from a business building perspective, the starting points are pretty dramatic, and this geographic spread of manufacturing undermines the ability to have that impact. Next slide. In the defense sector, which is a very large portion of the federal government and a budget and a very substantial catalyst for innovation in our economy, there has been a drop-off of small business activity in defense procurement over the past decade. The Department of Defense is very aware of it. They frankly are the one part of the national government that has a pretty explicit small business strategy, which we follow quite closely. But this also provides some structural challenges to having inclusive outcomes. Next slide. As the energy transition is underway, and everyone on this call can think about the buildings they live in, how they get to work, the broader community, the power they consume, whether it's from renewable sources, whether it's from older sources, fossil fuels. All of this is going to change pretty radically and pretty fast in the United States. because of federal policies and federal investments. From our perspective, that offers up the opportunity for enormous business opportunities for Black and Latino and Asian and women-owned firms, if they can get the support to transition from the kind of products and services they're providing today to the new products and services that will be demanded by the climate economy. And this slide from Next Street, colleagues of ours, shows what that will look like in different sectors. Finally, manufacturing faces an enormous workforce shortage. We're talking about millions of jobs, good jobs, quality jobs, but they're going to require a level of training and reskilling. And again, the further away workers are from these industrial factories, the more difficult that's going to be. Next slide. So here's what's happening around the country. Next slide. You know, on the challenge side, what we have is this mix of industrial sprawl, job sprawl, spatial mismatch, workforce shortages. Cities have a role here, even though in many cities they may not have these large land parcels that are available for large factories, but they can play in the supply chain, and they can ground a dispersed manufacturing ecosystem around applied research, around supplier development, around workforce development. So there are significant roles cities can play. Next slide. And what we're beginning to see, and this is typically the way the US works, we don't really have a national plan. What we have is sort of a national direction, a federal direction. And then cities and metropolitan areas and states generally fill in the blanks in ways that align to their distinctive assets and advantages. So we're beginning to see a group of cities begin to step up and say, well, wait a second, we have a role to play here. And as I'll walk through, you'll see the very different roles that cities have to play and the different strategies they can undertake. It's not critical to get lost in all the specifics here, and everyone will have access to this presentation. But I think what this reflects is the driving thesis of the Nowak Metro Finance Lab and the book, The New Localism, that Jeremy Nowak and I co-authored 5 years ago. Cities are networks of corporate, civic, and public institutions and intermediaries and leaders, and cities are the sort of vanguard of problem solving. So quickly, I'll just go quickly through this. Next slide. Flint, Michigan is doing a full industrial playbook because Flint was the birthplace of General Motors. They have Kettering University, which is a co-op engineering school, a lot like Drexel. And basically Kettering wants to be the center of EV battery recycling knowledge in the state of Michigan. So they have a full playbook around this and are now seeking funding. Next slide. Cincinnati, the Cincinnati Port Authority owns an enormous amount of industrial land. They are trying to repurpose that land for industrial uses with very innovative financing mechanisms. That's a critical piece. Next slide. Indianapolis is working with their state around Industry 4.0 so they can upgrade technologies in manufacturing firms to be more competitive. Next slide. St. Louis is trying to ground their aerospace and automotive sectors in the north side of St. Louis, which is one of the most distressed, disadvantaged parts of that city and metropolitan area. So a new advanced manufacturing innovation center in the north side of St. Louis to work with Boeing, to work with GM and the supply chain. Next slide. One of the best workforce training programs in the United States is in Buffalo, New York, the east side of Buffalo, the Northland Workforce Training Center, working with dozens of manufacturing firms across that region. Next slide. El Paso is expanding their airport to help Latino businesses become a bigger part of defense procurement, military procurement. Very smart move, anticipating where a lot of activity will go. Next slide. East Providence in Rhode Island with state funding is becoming a staging ground for offshore wind production. Rhode Island is really the initial leader in offshore wind in the United States around Block Island. And here they're trying to capture some of the production supply chain. Next slide. And finally, Wichita, Kansas, which is one of the great aerospace centers of the United States and the world, is basically using a full ecosystem approach to retain and enhance their position. Next slide. So what comes next? Next slide. Well, what this mostly shows is that cities are going to have to bring order out of chaos to some extent. There's a lot of federal funding. There's a lot of disruptive market dynamics. There's a lot of changes underway in the world. Cities are the one place where different sectors can come together and begin to design and ultimately deliver strategies that are aligned with their distinctive position. So that's new localism. Cities think like systems and act like entrepreneurs. That's what you're seeing around the country today. Next slide. So we have been planning the post-industrial city. For decades, we need to deliver the industrial city. And cities are just beginning to sort out these different hard questions. What's your industrial edge? Who's in your ecosystem? Who are your suppliers? What's your land look like? What's your innovation play? Workforce imperative, infrastructure strategy, small business opportunity. This is the complexity of the industrial and energy transition that we have underway. So next slide. This is a presentation that was provided or prepared by multiple colleagues of mine and myself. It's great to present it today at Drexel, and look forward to any and all questions. Thank you very much. Thanks, Anna. Really appreciate that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bruce. Like I said, I think we have a few minutes for some questions. If anybody wants to pop them in, there should be a Q&A section at the bottom. So yeah, start asking any questions. Perhaps in the meantime, while we're waiting for some to come through, Bruce, maybe you could elaborate perhaps on Philadelphia's role in these patterns, and maybe Drexel's vested interest in this as a co-op school.
Well, I think Philadelphia is obviously, and West Philadelphia, where Drexel's located, sort of exhibits this. Philadelphia is really at the vanguard of gene and cell therapy and precision medicine in the world. So as students on the campus see a lot of construction, whether it's Spark Therapeutics, which is on Drexel property across from 30th Street, or as you move up Market Street, beyond 40th Street and beyond, what you're beginning to see is the market really take hold. And that is a sort of, the interplay of Drexel and Penn and the hospitals and companies, both large and small, realizing that, Philadelphia has become, one of the global nodes of biomedicine, along with Boston and San Francisco and Houston and so forth. But so this is a part of the industrial transition. I think what Philadelphia and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania need to sort out is how are they going to play in these broader manufacturing shifts and these broader energy shifts, because Pennsylvania is not like Michigan, which is fairly obvious. It's the American center of the auto sector. So it's not complicated to figure out what you do in Michigan. It's not complicated to figure out what you do in Wichita, which is such a major aerospace. Pennsylvania and Philadelphia is more diversified manufacturing economy. So you got to do a little thinking here. And I think that's what's underway with the new governor, and now the new mayor, who won't take office for some period of time, but political leadership with business and university leadership in both the city, the metropolitan area, and the state are in a little bit of a catch-up mode right now with these broader manufacturing sectors. But great bio play, but now it has to diversify a bit.
Great. Well, that's fantastic. Such interesting work. We do have a couple questions coming through. Perhaps I'll just read them out to you. How effective and efficient is the U.S. government in getting investment out to cities and regions? Are there bottlenecks, or are these processes moving effectively?
I would say that the federal government, I was chief of staff at HUD, and went back under Obama to work during the mortgage crisis in 2009, 2010. I would say the federal government has been quite efficient and nimble and agile with regard to this industrial policy. What you're seeing is the center of gravity in the national government shift a bit to the Commerce Department, because they control a lot of the funding for these centers of excellence and regional tech hubs, to the Energy Department and the Environmental Protection Agency because of the climate transition, and to the Department of Defense always. Someone once called the federal government a healthcare company with an army. That continues to be the case in some respects. So they're pushing a large amount of funding out very fast, because they're trying to accelerate this industrial and energy transition, some through grants to states, cities, counties, some through competitive processes, some through low-cost financial products, some through the tax code. This is really complicated stuff. You need a master class in all of this to teach. But I would say they've done a very good job of trying to move money out fast and provide guidance as quickly as possible in a federal government that has been degraded over time. It has lost its capacity, but they've bulked it up. And compared to our competitors or our partners, this is remarkable for the US. We really haven't seen anything like it in a very, very long time. So I would give them a pretty high grade in terms of how they've been able to move the money out.
That's great. Great question. We have another question. We talk a lot about upgrading and focusing on and integrating transit, but are you seeing real steps towards making that happen in these plans, or are these projects often happening in isolation of those larger conversations?
Well, it's just a phenomenal question. I mean, to tell you the truth, I think a lot of this, is happening in a compartmentalized way. The left hand doesn't particularly know what the right hand is doing. And again, we're talking about ecosystems. The factories don't operate themselves. I mean, we still need workers, we need suppliers, we need logistics, we need transit to get. So it's not all quite, humming along, because, we haven't done this in a very long time. And therefore, we've lost muscle memory of what is a full integrated industrial policy. I think what the US is very good at is catching up very fast, compared to Europe in particular, and compared to many other countries, because we're so distributed in terms of who does what. We are able to work across disciplines and sectors and jurisdictions more nimbly, I think, than anyone else in the world. But it's a little messy right now, is what I would say. And that's why we put together this presentation and this overview, because we're trying to help everyone connect the dots. Ultimately, in the perfect world, you would have metropolitan planning organizations that would begin to integrate a lot of this. But we're sort of jerry-rigging this as we go forward. Very American, quintessentially American.
Most definitely. Well, again, great question. Another one, great presentation. Thanks for that. How do you see the industrial transition on what concerns the increase of remote work and or work not really related to physical places?
Well, that's, again, phenomenal question. Here's a proposition. And Philadelphia, like Chicago, like San Francisco, like many other great cities, are seeing the effect of remote work on their office districts, their central business districts. It is possible, and I would say it's absolutely necessary, that this manufacturing transition must be used as part of the rebound of our central business districts in our downtowns. Now, that may seem a little strange because we're not going to put a semiconductor facility in the middle of downtown Philadelphia. But what we could do is have centers of excellence, academy research, corporate campuses, in the cores of our cities, so that we can begin to reoccupy space that has now been lost due to remote work. So a whole bunch of places are beginning to look at possibilities here, whether it's military related or whether it's related to the civilian economy or clean tech. And I do think you may see a burst of activity. Most cities, universities, are located in midtowns rather than downtowns. West Philadelphia, to some extent, is a midtown compared to the downtown of Philadelphia. But you may see some shifting around of university assets, not whole universities, but those bits that are very focused on innovation and are basically provided federal subsidy to expand their efforts within what are now not completely empty, but radically suppressed, office markets.
Excellent. And finally, what about the increasing donut effect seen in more and more cities? The commercial real estate then is in a very precarious financial position.
Well, I think it's going to take a decade to get through the transition post-COVID. And again, as you can tell from this presentation, if all we had over the last several years, which would have been more than enough, was the pandemic, that would have had some structural effects on city economies because of this remote work from home effect and what that means for agglomeration of office workers. Well, once office workers begin to stay home for 2 or 3 days a week, you have this domino effect on commercial real estate owners, on transit ridership, on small business, on tax revenue. So it's going to take a while to sort all this out. And for me, the most important, economic year is probably 2025. Next year is a big political year because of the presidential election, congressional elections. But in 2025, I think we're going to begin to see the full tax effect and commercial real estate effect of what's been underway. But there's another piece going on here, which no one anticipated, which was the geopolitical tensions with Russia and China. I mean, I don't think anyone expected Russia to invade Ukraine, or for the West, for the European Union and the US to unite against it, which was the right thing to do. And I don't think anyone anticipated this growing polarized world of China, basically, and the US being sort of in this really hard competition around very sensitive technologies, and with the rest of the world beginning to try to align themselves, with one of these two of these blocks, or to remain not aligned. This is really complicated stuff, on top of all the structural work, on top of climate change. So, how anyone begins to navigate through all of this, I don't think any city or metropolitan area or state really have like a skunk works operation and said, hey, in 5 years, all this is going to hit at the same time. What do we do? We're Americans. We're making it up as we go along, this time with a hell of a lot of federal money. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see whether a couple places are able to take advantage of all this disruption and begin to reset the so-called hierarchy of American cities. Pre-COVID, we had superstar cities, primarily San Francisco and LA and Seattle and Boston and New York. They dominated the innovation portion of our economy. And then there's a couple new entrants like Austin, but they dominated. That's not the case in this post-COVID economy. San Francisco is in a free fall. A complete free fall. And a lot of this industrial shifts actually benefit older industrial places. Think Detroit, think Cleveland, et cetera. So, and potentially Philadelphia. So this is a really different kind of moment. It requires different kind of planning and delivery that I think most cities are used to, with their metros and their states. But that's, there's always, in all these areas of crisis, there's always opportunity. So we'll see, how this plays out. Drexel has a really critical role in all this because of its focus on the practical. A lot of folks focus, at the 50,000 foot level. I think Drexel is remarkable as an institution for focusing on that big framing and paradigmatic level, but also how does this affect the ground and people in the real world? So we'll see how this plays out.
Great. Well, that seems like a pretty good way to end this. Thank you, obviously, everyone, for all your great questions. Thank you, Bruce, for taking the time out to do this. Obviously, a fantastic presentation. We'll let you get on with the rest of the day and your great work. To everyone else, again, we are just getting started. My colleague Rogelio mentioned at the beginning, but we have a full day of panels. Our student panels are going to start around 11 a.m. You should be able to access that through Symposium or through any emails that you might have gotten. You should be able to, directly click on those links. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to email global@drexel.edu. But thank you again, Bruce. Thank you again, Professor Katz and Rogelio, for taking the time out, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks to the Vice Provost for inviting us. Talk soon.